English professor and chair of the Department of Communication here at Mason. His published works include more than 350 articles, books, and monographs focusing on health communication and promotion, and dealing in particular with information technology, multicultural relations, and risk and crisis management. Speaking second is Tony Berman, who was managing director of Al Jazeera-English for more than 2 years in Qatar and is now Al Jazeera's head of strategies for the Americas here in Washington. During his time as managing director of Al Jazeera-English, Tony's guided the growth in North America, including cable here in Washington, for Al Jazeera. The channel's audience reaches worldwide and is now seen in more than 200 million households in more than 100 nations around the world. Our third speaker, Dr. Mark Gopin, is the professor of religion, diplomacy, and conflict resolution and director of the Center of Religion and Diplomacy and Conflict Resolution at ICAR here at Mason. Dr. Gopin has lectured on conflict resolution around the world and has trained thousands of people involved in peacemaking strategies. And so with that, we'll turn over our conversation to Dr. Krebs.
Good morning. Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. I wanted to mention before we get started that there's another event following this one where the former CEO of Hill & Knowlton, which is one of the largest international public relations firms, is going to be talking about some of the issues related to public relations and ethics. So if you're available, I'm going to encourage you to stay for that presentation as well. We're living in a very interesting time. Things are changing rapidly. People have said that we are in the midst of an information revolution. And that information revolution has made contact with a wide range of different people more readily available to more people than ever before. There's tremendous amounts of information that's available that has changed our worlds. But as much change as we've seen here in the West, the changes in other parts of the world where they've had more repressed media environments has been amazing. In China, in the Middle East, in a number of different places in the world, in Africa, where there have often been repression and censorship of information, people for the first time have access to a variety of different sources of information. They're able to compare and contrast different reports. Not only are they able to get more information, but they also have more contact with their peers. And that contact has made a huge difference. That interaction has allowed them to see what opportunities exist, to find out whether or not their feelings of concern, their feelings of repression, their feelings about change are shared by other people. And once they found out that there are other people who feel the same way, it led to some opportunities for coordination, organization, and change that have really rocked a variety of long-term dictatorships that had not seen change for a long time. Now, access to information does not mean that the media changed everything. It means that it became a tool that allowed long-seated frustration to take root and allowed people to organize to make changes. However, those changes have been very difficult, and the governments who are being challenged are not moving out of the way easily. There's been a tremendous need to get information about what's going on in those countries, to let others know so that the other countries can provide support, limit destructive violence, and to promote coordination and cooperation. So today what I want to do is discuss with you some of the major things that have happened in the Middle East that have really changed the face of those governments and are changing it as we speak. And the media has played a large role. So with that as an introduction, I'd like to introduce to you my friend from Al Jazeera, Tony.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. I'll just keep my remarks brief as well, just to kind of give you maybe a context in which Al Jazeera and the so-called Arab awakening kind of converged. The first thing I should say to a North American audience, and I've spoken to many both in Canada and the U.S., I'm Canadian by birth, is that Al Jazeera is seen less so, I think, today than perhaps a few years ago as being somewhat controversial, given the tensions, particularly around 9/11 with the American government, between some of the tensions that existed vis-a-vis the Israeli government, even though Al Jazeera is kind of is available and widely watched in Israel. But what's really very not unknown certainly little appreciated in North America, is that the biggest sense of tension between Al Jazeera and governments really has been within the Arab world. There have been far more tensions between Al Jazeera, Arabic and English, with the authoritarian governments in the Arab world, right dating back to the creation of Al Jazeera in 1996, Al Jazeera Arabic. I can't think of an Arab country that Al Jazeera has not been thrown out of. And the reason for that is that Al Jazeera, we have flaws. It's history on the run, like all news channels, but does embrace democracy, embraces free expression, embraces all of those things that authoritarian Arab governments loathe. And so I think in that sense, that's been really the pattern. And so if you go back almost 6 months, in the middle of December, which was when Tunisia started, and it started, Al Jazeera had reporters both in Tunisia and in Egypt, although the relationship with the two governments was again incredibly acrimonious, because I think Al Jazeera was seen by these governments, these dictatorships, as seen very much as a potential threat, because Al Jazeera attempted to give voice to the many forces within these countries that oppose these governments. There was the story, many of you probably have heard of it, of this food vendor who was humiliated and slapped by Tunisian authorities, a Tunisian police woman actually, and kind of went back to his home and basically set himself alight. He burned himself. He felt that the lack of dignity, lack of respect for all of his life really just came crashing down on him. And it was captured. Some of the video of it was captured. And obviously it was not captured by a reporter at the time. That would have been too much of a coincidence. It was run on Facebook. It was then put on YouTube and then taken down. And it was basically recorded by Al Jazeera. And Al Jazeera started running the story of this food vendor and the story of his situation through its newscasts. And that did tend to kind of go right across the Middle East. And so I think in some of the debates about the Arab awakening was this a Twitter revolution? Was it a Facebook revolution? And I think the answer is obviously no. I mean, it was a Tunisian revolution. It was an Egyptian revolution. But clearly, the existence of social media really had an impact that tended to kind of make the world and make the Arab world, much smaller than it ever was. I mean, sometimes in these discussions there's reference to the French Revolution. And in the French Revolution, word of the French Revolution really went by boat across the oceans, and then weeks later, people in Haiti heard about it, and then they basically did a similar revolt. But there was a lag of several weeks, several months, and that's the way things were many hundreds of years ago. But now there's no lag. We all live in the moment, and I think what really the existence of Facebook and Twitter, the incredible ubiquity of Al Jazeera in the homes of the Arab world, meant that what happened in Tunisia instantly became known in Egypt, became known in Algeria, in Yemen, in Libya, and I think in that sense, what I think happened is that there was a convergence between the dominant television networks and in the Arab world. Al Jazeera unquestionably is the dominant television network with social media, and it was really a kind of almost like a loop that kept reinforcing. And I think what you saw happen is in Egypt, many people who perhaps for 40 years were reluctant to go to the streets were in fact encouraged to do that by what they saw, the bravery and the courage of many of the people in Tunisia. And I think in that sense, Al Jazeera, is really quite humble in its own sense of its role in this story, but it played a central role, but very much in partnership with the people who clearly felt that decades of oppression and decades of dictatorship was just unacceptable. I know there are many, many angles and issues and avenues we can go down, and I'll just, we can do that in the Q&A. I'll just kind of leave it at that, but that's the opening context of Al Jazeera's unique relationship with this incredible historic story, which is still at play now in the Middle East.
it's a pleasure to be here. Most of our work at CRDC is on the other campus in Arlington, and it's just wonderful to be here with you folks, except for some of you who come on our seminars and trips, which has been a pleasure. I just want to reflect a little bit on our vantage point in terms of conflict analysis and conflict resolution, and how it relates to these revolutions and to media, in the sense that the backdrop of the relationship between cities like Washington, both inside government and outside government, in these revolutions, is one of a global confrontation that's been happening and evolving for many years now, especially since the end of the Cold War. Basically, whether we like it or not, the vast majority of engagements between the United States military and others around the world has involved hostilities in which people from one civilization have ended up with casualties, and another civilization have ended up with casualties, and there's a great deal of tension, as we know, between the United States and the peoples of the Middle East. Al Jazeera, in some ways, sits right in the middle of that. And so we look at this from a conflict analysis point of view, and we say that it is true that these revolutions have taken place in every living room across the Middle East, but they have not necessarily taken place in a similar way in the living rooms of the United States, because in many ways at the present time we tend to look at different sources of media, and therefore it makes our job kind of challenging. We have an entire Facebook network. We were deeply involved, many of us who have been peace activists for many years, were deeply involved in the revolutions and doing exactly what the demonstrators asked of people to do, which was to Facebook and Twitter and to keep on passing the information. And yet, we also knew that in some ways our networks were limited, that this is a globe that is not necessarily united by all the same media all the time, and that there are vantage points and filtering and ways of looking at these things that create either trust or distrust, depending upon the media that you're looking at. Okay, we all know that medias have slants. Media outlets have slants and sometimes severe biases to the point of being just entertainment, for fear, and so on. So we've looked at this and we've said, yes, this has been a revolutionary turning point in terms of Facebook revolutions, in terms of theory, of social network theory. I wrote a lot in my last book on social network theory, which does emphasize the importance of loose ties, the ways in which our loose social networks matter a great deal to how our opinions change and how we evolve in terms of our attitudes to war and peace or enemy systems. But at the same time, real revolutions don't occur without very, very strong ties between those who are committed to each other in almost a militant way to move forward with their revolutionary path. So the truth is somewhere in the middle. Gladwell has criticized his own, the very thing that he has unleashed in terms of tipping points by saying that true revolutions involve a militant group that's committed to each other. That's true, but it's also true that we're living in an unprecedented time in which everything is in real time, and everyone's involved in revolutionary movements almost to the moment. However, it is still the case that we are a divided world in which some are watching some media and getting some Facebook messages, and others are getting the opposite interpretations. And from a conflict analysis point of view, that's still a fascinating challenge. And then therefore we look to where you folks fit into that, where people who think of themselves as powerless or as relatively disempowered, with their 500 friends, whether they in fact matter to where and how the world operates in its enemy systems and its conflict systems. And we argue, and the theories argue, that actually you're the key. That people considering themselves part of the loose ties of the world that move things in one direction or another is the essential question of the future of social attitudes and of conflict. And that's where a great deal of our emphasis now is how do you take basically good motivation, say, for conflict resolution and move them into something that's truly effective. and that has to do also with messaging. And we're doing a lot of thinking about messaging. Just yesterday I was on a panel at a group called Global Zero that is trying to eliminate basically nuclear weapons. And I don't know, I was shocked yesterday to find that President Obama would not even sign the agreement to reduce the hair trigger between the United States and Russia. We still have a 60-second hair trigger in terms of the weapons of the United States and Russia to this day. And I thought they were all sort of shelved and we were at peace and so on. And so, but we had this wonderful interfaith panel, and Richard Cizik, who's a wonderful evangelical pastor and activist, said something at one point about vision. And he said, vision without action is a hallucination. And my 15-year-old who was in the audience noticed that everybody started twittering right away, and they posted it. You know, like 5 people posted it. And she said, you know, Dad, you don't have any quotable quotes. You know, you didn't have a quotable quote. And so we said, okay, well, we have to work on that for every speech from now on, because somebody's gonna Facebook it. Well, this matters. This is almost like the nuts and bolts of the question of social change, and the question of how change happens. And I think this is something that we need to address, because we're right at the nexus, talking about these emerging revolutions in the Middle East. I can tell you, I come from a community where the vast majority of the community saw these democratic changes as objects of incredible fear. Fear of the change of the status quo, fear of the unleashing of Arab rage across the world, and so on. So the vantage point and what you're seeing matters with every single message. And the more messages that come out that show incredible democratic revolutionaries, not people who are crazy and just want to kill, the more that you're breaking down stereotypes with each message that's shifted. Every single message either reinforces enemy systems or it starts to break them down. And the arithmetic of that is something that I think we need to think about for the future, and that's why we're so buddy-buddy with the communications department, and because they're fabulous people. And that's the kind of discussions that we want to provoke. So thank you.
Thank you. We're going to have the bulk of our time today for question and answer. I think that particularly when we talk about social media and peer-to-peer communication, it's important for a significant part of our conversation to be back and forth with people in the audience. So if you haven't prepared a question, or if you have prepared a question and you want to say it aloud, by all means, stand up. I'll recognize you, and we'll have a chance to do that. While you're thinking about this, though, I will ask the first question to the panel. The question is about the way that media may be changing in this recent cycle of democratization. Traditionally, I think that the media have been, in many ways, forces towards exacerbating conflict rather than working in the direction of resolution. There's a lot of coverage of violence. There's a lot of tendency in terms of the people quoted to focus on more extreme voices and more extreme points of view. And one of the things that has struck me as very different about the way that traditional media have been behaving in this cycle of development is that there has been less of that. That there seems to be more of a movement towards a focus on the voices, of public voices, if you will, of what's going on in the conversation, and less about the conflict and the intractability of that conflict that sometimes really focuses the media's attention on the violence. And so I open it up to the panelists to talk about how this may be very different, or not, if you don't accept that premise, in terms of the way the media and the conversation is occurring.
Let me start off. I think that you have a point that there has been some media coverage that has tried to look at the larger picture and help to solve problems. But I see that most media coverage is based on drama. It's based on getting people's attention and identifying new and exciting activities. And there are probably different stages in different international events and conflicts where the media actually promotes violent activity and resistance, and because it shows models of where that kind of behavior is going on, and it demonstrates repression that people are not comfortable with, that incites them and encourages them to come out and to work with others. The social media had a really powerful voice in connecting people so that they were no longer alone. It's very hard to do a revolution all by yourself. You need to have a lot of people working with you. For a revolution to take root, you've got to have a variety of people who are moving in the same direction, who are working together, who are demonstrating public concern, who are willing to take a stance, and willing in many ways to be martyrs. And I think the media really illustrated that and encouraged others to jump on. At a certain point, however, within the conflict, I find that the public has a powerful need for some kind of conclusion, and we can't handle the uncertainty, the changes, the growing violence for very long. So at certain points in the conflict, I think that the media starts pushing for a sense of conclusion, a sense of solving the problems. They may even recommend strategies. And so I think at different points, you've got to look at it as kind of an unfolding drama. You'll see that the media serves a variety of different purposes. But the media is not, a unimorphic, one piece, one channel. We have so many different channels of communication, and they're not all saying the same thing. They're saying a variety of different things. And so you need to make some choices about which media you're going to pay attention to, which media that you're going to utilize to voice your concerns, and which media you're going to follow in terms of making decisions about your own actions.
I think there are a lot of fascinating differences this time compared to previous situations. But I agree with the point that the media are not a monolithic force. And for example, I think the coverage by Al Jazeera of this story was distinctly different than the so-called Western mainstream media, as one would expect it to be. Al Jazeera has correspondents and crews and producers throughout the region, and has had for years. I think institutionally, it has a knowledge of the region that's understandably kind of unparalleled. So I think it also has. It's not commercially driven as much as North American or American networks, so that it is able to devote a lot of airtime, not only to news coverage of breaking events, but also to documentaries, and in other words, right from the beginning of the Tunisian revolution, right through Egypt and Libya, now Syria and Yemen. We've been able to broadcast and rebroadcast countless documentaries and historical explainer pieces, that kind of thing. I think I was a field journalist in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, in the late 80s, as the Soviet Empire kind of fell apart. And I think there were so many quote-unquote surprises that were in front of us then, except that when you kind of look back on it 10 years later or 25 years later, you realize that there was a fundamental contradiction in the whole Soviet model that inevitably pointed to a collapse. The fact that the collapse happened when it did took people by surprise, but the fact that it happened really should have taken no one by surprise. And I think that's the same view as we look back on the so-called Arab awakening, that there have been for decades contradictions in the world's treatment of these governments and of this part of the world. Western governments, and the leading one clearly being the United States, for whatever motivation you can say it's honorable or not honorable, have been complicit in creating a structure within the Arab world that for the vast majority of people who lived in it led to poverty, led to an absence of opportunities, led to a total dead end on the part of young people. So anyone who had experience moving in and out of the Middle East, and I have as a journalist on many occasions over the past 20 years, and as Steve mentioned, for 2.5 years I lived in the Middle East, in Qatar with Al Jazeera. It's impossible not to realize that this was a house of cards that will collapse on people's heads sooner than later. The fact that it happened in Tunisia, the fact that the flashpoint was the handling of a Tunisian food vendor, all of these things. So there were surprises in that. But I think what happened is that the a kind of the Western approach to this incredibly important part of the world was so self-serving from the point of view of Western governments in Western countries that kind of contradiction had to kind of fall apart. I think what has been somewhat encouraging is that I think that the Western mainstream media have cottoned on to that because the story has gone on so long. So I think that why would, for example, in a country with 6,000 years of tradition in Egypt, why would a dictator like Mubarak, that whose actions have led to the death, indirectly or directly, of hundreds of thousands of people, either through poverty or through the acts of its own intelligence, why would that kind of regime, that so strongly backed by Western governments, be allowed to survive for so long? And I think that kind of analysis, which beyond the drama, beyond the firefights, and beyond all of these things which capture our attention on television, these are the central issues, because if you live in the Middle East and if you're close to the people who live there, particularly young people, who clearly made a decision, and again, I think somewhat aided and abetted by the existence of these social media tools, they clearly made a decision that no, whether they're 20 years old or 22 years old, that I am not going to live 40 years of the same kind of poverty, fear, and lack of dignity and respect that my parents have gone through. And the society snapped, and I think what happened is a lot of the parents, what you had the interesting thing in Egypt is you had, through conventional television, you had the Egyptian government, the Mubarak government, trying to kind of communicate to the parents sitting at home. They're not twittering, they're not in the square. They were trying to telegraph to the parents sitting at home, get your kids off the street, out of the square, because this thing is going to rock this country in ways that one can only fear. And there was hesitation on the part of that generation which has been cowed and intimidated for decades. But what happened, and again, I think social media helped it, Al Jazeera certainly helped it, that what happened is just as there was a kind of a decision on the part of young people that they will not take this anymore, I think there was almost like a collective decision on the part of a lot of parents that not only will they not go to the Tahrir Square to pull their kids home, they'll go to Tahrir Square to actually join them. And then the House of Cards collapses. And I guess my only point, and I'll conclude here, is that at the end of the day, the media must help people, particularly in far-off parts of the world like America or Canada, must help people to understand the process that is at play. And that's far less dramatic than a lot of what happens, but far more important. And I think my sense was that as the weeks went on, and as people kind of ran out of things to say, they had no choice but to examine this regime called Mubarak's regime that has gone relatively unexamined in the American media for 40 years, and realize that this man was a despotic tyrant. But worse, he was there because of the complicity and support of Western governments. And I think that disturbed a lot of Americans, as it did a lot of Canadians. And I think in that sense, I think there was a positive outcome of this media coverage.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I agree totally with the professor and with Tony's comments especially with the professor on drama. And this is one of our frustrations. Many of us have been working on democratization and conflict resolution and human rights for decades and decades, and nobody pays attention to anything that we do. Okay? There were hundreds of organizations across the Middle East and in Egypt and everywhere you can imagine, and none of that is ever covered by the media. None of it. I mean, I'll never forget sitting at the World Economic Forum with all of these dictators and the richest people in the world in Sharm el-Sheikh. And I'm sitting there with Faisal Abdul Rauf, one of the most wonderful Islamic democratic leaders. And we're sitting there in a room. All the cameras are with the Mubaraks and the others, And we're sitting there saying, I said, Faisal, if you punch me in the mouth right now, they'll all come over here. But all of our declarations for peace between religions and tolerance and democracy, they won't care. So there was a drama here that caught the media because the media likes drama. And so that translates into a very frustrating realization for us simple folks, which is that unless we have hundreds of thousands of people with us, there's no drama. And unless those people are being assaulted by bad police, there's no drama. And so once you had those assaults on innocent people, courageous people, then it was news. Then it became history. And then you start tearful policemen, hugging people in the square. And it's high drama. And then Anderson Cooper goes over. And, and Anderson was great. But how many times can he be hit? You're absolutely right. How many times can he be hit in the head before people want a conclusion? And then, of course, you have to have Geraldo staging, his courageous work in Libya. But after that, after the entertainment is gone, it goes back to those boring questions of where are the social movements, where is the media, and it's very, very hard in the visual media to sustain this. And that's why I think that it comes to a hard conclusion that there are only two ways that average people contribute to this, and that's either through violent revolution or nonviolent revolution. Our feeling, if you look at Libya, a violent revolution is doesn't usually have nearly as good results as nonviolent revolutions, according to our research. But this is the harsh reality of media, social change, and when there are tipping points to when people start to notice what you're doing with your life.
Questions? Yes, please.
Hey, how you doing? My name is Victor Kosle. I'm a film major here at Mason. You just said something that caught my attention. You said that the media likes drama. And I find that really, really interesting because it's a question that I think we've talked about inside my comm class also. And it's that, if it's the average citizen that's watching the media, and we watch it, and we don't like what we see, wouldn't it change? Because they have to show something that we see, or ratings will come, or they won't make their money. So is it the media that likes the drama, or is it the people who's watching the media that likes the drama?
It's kind of a chicken or egg question, which came first, Does the media create the reality? Does the media report the reality? Well, there's a little bit of both going on there. Certainly the media are selective about what it covers. And as Mark was saying, that the media loves excitement and drama because it perks interest and gets people to pay attention. And so there's a focus on those issues over many other newsworthy issues that are not particularly visually appealing or exciting. But I think that there are many different sources of media, and as Tony was pointing out, not all the media are as commercially driven, and some media are more socially driven. Some media are more community driven. Some media are based on individual needs. And we have a range of different types of media now, and the social media has really changed the mix. In many of these countries where they had government controlled media for many, many years, there was only one story, and it was the government story. And after a while, people realized this was the government story, and nobody seemed to pay much attention because they didn't really believe it. But now that there are a variety of different sources of information, and you can contrast the government story with other people's story, with personal accounts, with YouTube videos, there's a lot more interest and excitement because you're seeing different conflicting points of view. And I think people can start reaching their own conclusions. I think it's very democratizing to have different sources of information available so that people can actually look at what's going on and make their own decisions. And also participate as people who are developing and sending out messages, not just as a silent audience.
Yeah, if I can just add, I think it's so obvious, I think, that the current model for mainstream American, I would include Canadian, North American media, is just broken. It's just broken. I saw this commercial this morning or last night on NBC. It was Brian Williams doing a NBC nightly news, and he was going on about how every night we have the privilege, and I think he said in 30 minutes, which in reality, because of commercials, is in 22 minutes, which is the model that was created, in the mid-60s. It is insane that the world's largest, most vigorous democracy would have as its chief outlet for information a 22-minute newscast. And I think what happens, and I speak as somebody who's spent more than 30 years with the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, including 8 years as its editor-in-chief, and I produce news programs, and I produce a whole variety of, I mean, there's less of a commercial focus in the CBC, but there still is one. And when you have 22 minutes to tell the world, and what you do is you compress things to a point of ludicrous comedy, you know, and I think that's the kind of the commercial model. So I think what's exciting now in 2011 is that there are many more sources of information. Things are converging. I think that Americans and Canadians are far less dependent on the three main networks, et cetera, et cetera. But I really do think that one thing I've always attacked, and I've always challenged, and I just don't believe it, I think it's absolute bullshit, is this notion that Americans don't have any interest in the world. Therefore, that justifies why there are so few international foreign bureaus now on the part of American news organizations. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think the only reason for that is that the coverage of the world now, particularly on television, is so brief and is so incomprehensible that why would people watch it? It doesn't make any sense. And therefore that's used to justify the kind of budget cuts. But I think that what's interesting, just to say one more small thing about Jazeera, what's interesting is the millions of Americans who are demanding through their cable and satellite carriers the right to make the choice themselves whether or not they want to watch it. You know, it's available in 220 million households, 105 countries throughout Canada. The single country of distinction that doesn't have it nationwide is the U.S., although it's available in 2 million households here in Washington. And I don't think that's a compliment to Al Jazeera. I think what that is, that's a reflection of the hunger on the part of a lot of Americans, a lot of informed, smart Americans, who realize that the security of themselves, of their families, of their loved ones, is very dependent on what's going on in the wider world, and it's really in their self-interest to get to know it. So, and I think that's why the business model that's at play right now, that has really gotten out of control, will eventually collapse, unlike the Soviet model and the kind of Arab dictatorial models, you know. And I think that's great, and I think it's important that people, particularly in an incredibly multicultural university like George Mason, or you know, people at your age, you know, clearly have an interest in the world, is really to demand that the windows are kept open, you know, because there's no country in the world that really deserves to have high quality coverage of the world flow into its households than the U.S., in my view.
Yeah, other questions, please. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Mark Herbert. I'm a student in Professor Klein's comm class. I was wondering, in contrast to Western-type media where Fox News, CNBC, CNN, all of this has a base group to cater to, you know, CNN, all these people are based on Americans, you know, BBC caters to the British. How does Al Jazeera deal with Middle Eastern versus Middle Eastern problems, you know, nation-to-nation problems in the Middle East, without having a single base group to whom to cater?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a work in progress. I mean, the Al Jazeera Arabic, it's pretty simple. I mean, it's dominant in the Arab world, which is primarily in the Middle East. It's the number one in terms of audience share, so it's a fairly straightforward example of a channel of a network that's very close to its audience. Al Jazeera-English is totally different. It operates editorially very different. There's kind of sharing of technical resources, but there's a separate editorial. And I think that, and we're building a profile, you know, and I would say, although I don't think politically there's any kind of comparison between The Economist, for example, and Al Jazeera. I mean, The Economist as a magazine attempts to be a kind of an international magazine where if you come to it as an American, you're getting a kind of a take on America that's very different than Time or Newsweek. You know, it has, although it's very British, it has a kind of an international calling. I think that Al Jazeera-English, I mean, it has more than 1,000 employees, 50 nationalities, 70 news bureaus, which is far more than both CNN and the BBC. So I think what it offers people who care is a far more global coverage of the world, like parts of the world, Asia, Latin America, Africa that are rarely intrude in American households except when there's a catastrophe happening. And I think it attempts to, it's not a Middle Eastern centric channel in spite of its name. I'm talking about the English channel because most of its audience is not in the Middle East. So I think on a good day it appeals to people, with not only within North America but worldwide, who are globally engaged with the world, who have a kind of a far more international interest in the world. We don't have, to pick up on where you were heading in your question, we don't have a home team. It's not London, it's not Atlanta, it's not New York, it's not Toronto. It's not actually Qatar, although that's where the office is, one of the headquarters is, because we're scattered in different broadcast centers. So I think at the end of the day, the success or failure of Al Jazeera English will be on its ability to appeal to the millions of people, not only in this country, but worldwide, who feel that they have no other alternative. That CNN, I think internationally, has a real problem with its reputation. It has a far, for a whole variety of reasons. The BBC, which I think most of us admire, is very much a British network. It's undergoing incredible cuts. So I think in terms of the developing world, I think that to a lot of people, Al Jazeera is the alternative. And so that's how we're going to cope with it. And the reality is after 4 years, it's now in 220 million households, which is far faster of growth than you saw either in the BBC or CNN. But I think it's a challenge. I think you've identified the challenge very well. And our expectation, if we could fast forward 4 or 5 or 10 years from now, it'll be stories like the Arab Awakening or the Gaza conflict, the Israeli-Gaza conflict, where we were the only channel that covered both sides of the conflict. It'll be a series of stories that will ultimately bring attention to it, and then people have got to decide whether they want that kind of global coverage.
In the last few months, you've seen Al Jazeera has grown tremendously in terms of reaching a broader audience. And one of the reasons for that, it was one of the only places that had access to a lot of the information about what was happening in many of the countries in the Middle East where there was tremendous turmoil. And I think because they had access to that information, they became a highly desired channel for gathering information. And their audience is changing. I think that becomes a great opportunity to reach a new audience. And while there may be set audiences for different channels, I don't think most media outlets are complacent with those audiences. They all would like to expand their reach and their influence. They'd like to get a larger audience. And I think the way to do that is to have access to information that people will find interesting and revealing. And so there's a compelling need for different media channels to go out and get the information. Now that's a contrast right now with the real movement to retrench and cut back, where foreign bureaus are being cut and seasoned journalists are being let go, and that's a real problem. So as our need for better information, as the world is in more turmoil, there's more need to provide information. There are less outlets that are providing that information. At the same time, I think that there's an opportunity here. There's an opportunity for emerging media to fill that vacant spot, to provide the information that's available. And that's exactly what Al Jazeera has been doing. They've been filling that need. And I find that laudatory, and I think it's going to have tremendous impact on their standing and expanding audiences. But by no means is the need for providing relevant, accurate information being filled at any level. There's tremendous needs that exist. And I think that many of you who may be aspiring journalists, there are opportunities out for independent journalists to go out and cover stories and get information out. There's more opportunity than ever before for people to gain an audience, to get their information out. You don't have to be part of a large media organization to cover different stories. If you have a video coverage or a story that's powerful and meaningful, you can find an audience nowadays. And that's part of the strength of the information revolution. It's changing the nature of the way we disseminate information. It's not just the major networks anymore. It's a new ballgame.
The other interesting thing that is that Al Jazeera has entered a fascinating moment in which they almost have no competition because the competition has zero credibility. and that is that the state medias have dominated for so long that no one believes them. And therefore, it's wide open. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't differences of opinion, or people feel sometimes Al Jazeera has a bias one way or another in terms of the revolutionaries, or one ethnic group over another, or secular over religious, or religious over secular. There's all sorts of things that fly about Al Jazeera. It doesn't matter. The states have no credibility. So, in the end, it's a very, very powerful moment for Al Jazeera, and in general for as you just said, for people opening up the information age wide open, especially in the Middle East.
Okay, other questions? Yes, please, in the back.
Hi, my name's Ricina. I'm in Professor Craig's comm class, and I have a question. Do you think that the problem might stem from actually, like, the way we're thought to think growing up, like the history books and the things we're taught to think are important, like the wars and things like that? Like, maybe it's not the information that we're broadcasting, but the value we put on it. It's the way we. Do you think it has anything to do with, what's in the history books rather than what's in the media?
How many of you pay attention to what's in the history books? Not that many. I have a feeling the media have a more powerful role than the history books. And in many ways, the history books reflect what's covered in the media. History is more art than science. And a lot of times, I think you need to be very cautious about, believing accepted wisdom. That's why I think I'm a really big fan of diverse sources of information. As purveyors of information, if you're interested in what's going on in the world, and as the world becomes more turbulent, the interest seems to be peaking. It probably behooves you to look at a variety of different sources, to really examine what different stories are being told, and make your own decisions. I think that you're right in a certain sense that we have kind of a set of accepted storylines for this is the world as we see it. But more and more, I think people are breaking away from that dogma. They're not accepting it, and they're looking at alternative interpretations. And I think that that's a very good thing.
Well, one of the things that perpetuates conflicts is that fear, and the fear of the unknown is one of the fundamental reasons why most people make bad decisions. Fear is actually a normal quality of being alert in a universe where you don't know what's going to happen. But fear also runs amok. And fear runs amok not just in media, but it also runs amok in history and documentation as well. So that a history dominated by this war and then this war and then this war is not only, it's based on fear, but it's just bad history. And we know that, and yet it's very hard to change those habits of the mind. And I think you're absolutely right, that it's not just the media, it's almost like the entire way in which whole nations organize themselves around the history of their wars and nobody has monuments to peacemakers and such. It's all monuments to warriors, and it's all based on that historical consciousness of first there was this Revolutionary War, then the Civil War, then the World War I, and so on. And it is a very hard habit to break, but there are some very interesting historians and others that are shaping history and trying to reshape history at the secondary educational level and at the college level in a different way. So I think it's a very, very astute point, and it goes to a lot of what we see about the challenges of why human beings continue to focus on fear and conflict.
Yes. Hi, my name is Rami Zavara. I'm a student of journalism here. Social media has had such an enormous effect, like you said, in the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, but when we get to the subject of Libya, there isn't as much, the argument can be made that there isn't as much a revolution going on as there is a civil war now. What about Libya and Gaddafi's regime is different? Why have these efforts been halted? Does it have to do with Western ties to the Libyan government? What about it has affected this halt of effort?
Well, as much as I've had experience covering the Middle East, and I've been to Libya a few times, I'm not a Libyan scholar, so I don't want to kind of get into predicting what is an incredibly horrific and unpredictable situation. But I think you've answered the question somewhat in that it's a totally different country. Libya, like Egypt, is a 6,000 year is a country. like you get into these, like, is Iraq a country? You go through some of these countries that were cobbled together in the past 80 years or 100 years or less, and Libya is somewhat like that. So in the sense that it's just beyond, I mean, I'm not learned enough in what's kind of going on right there to know, but I mean, it's a totally different situation than Tunisia and Egypt, and clearly Western involvement, particularly in that country, given the erratic course of Gaddafi, who also has been in power for 40 years. There's something magical about that figure. But I'm not sure where it's going to go. It doesn't have the kind of the base that you would see in Egypt or in Tunisia, so I think in that sense it's quite scary.
I think that I agree completely with what Tony said, and just to add to that, I think just to be generous with Western approaches to this, is that people naively looked at Mubarak and then in Tunisia, and they say, Gaddafi's even crazier than all the others. I mean, he's known globally as a lunatic. None of the Arab world likes him, and so he should fall pretty easily. And then you had the rebels saying, "Help us, help us, help us! We're about to be massacred." And people just didn't anticipate the tribal relations and which tribes he had with him and which mercenaries he had, and the fact that it would be a full-scale war. And it's quite tragic. From a conflict analysis and conflict resolution point of view, I think about models of nonviolent resistance, and we all face this moral moment about whether we agreed with an intervention or not, and I was begging for an intervention. Some of my colleagues at ICAR were totally opposed to it, but in the end of the day, I wish the protesters had actually gone home and regrouped, in the sense that, again, nonviolent resistance, when it moves to rebellion movements, usually ends in catastrophe. And this just gave him all the excuses he needed, Gaddafi, to mobilize his tribes and everybody even more. So it's quite tragic, and no one knows where it's going to go, but it was clearly not a mobilization of everybody expected Tripoli to go with the revolution, and that's not what happened. So it's a very interesting learning moment also about patterns of nonviolent resistance movements, but very tragic.
I'm not really sure exactly what's happening in Libya, but from my read on it, Gaddafi doesn't really care much about public opinion. He doesn't really care whether or not people like him or not. Most people don't. And he was willing to escalate rapidly and, go to the mattresses and, fight, like there was no tomorrow, which really raised the tenor of the conflict that was quite different from the other countries. And I'm not sure that the rebels were ready for that or had the capacity for dealing with that. And so it's changed the whole nature. Now that there's kind of a international part to this, it's going to be interesting to see how it raises. The real difference is that the international peacekeepers, which I don't know if that's the right term or not, do care about public relations. They care about their images, and so they're being very cautious, and they're looking to the future. They want to see how everything's going to fall back together. And so the advantage I think that Gaddafi has right now is that he doesn't care, and he can do whatever he wants, and he's very unpredictable. And so the thing is that if he goes too far, maybe it will trigger public opinion against him so strongly that others will come in to help. But right now, it looks like the rebels are not very well organized, and they certainly can't match Gaddafi's firepower.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Phil Su. I'm also in Steve Klein's Econ class. I was wondering, since the media has such an interest in drama, do you think that sometimes they report heavily on the enthusiasm and the wild emotions of these revolutions rather than focusing on the aftermath and the potential implications of it?
Yes.
Yeah, again, I mean, I think that's obviously true depending on who you're talking. I don't think there's a monolithic kind of treatment, and clearly you would expect me to say this. I mean, I think Al Jazeera has been there for years and will be in this region for decades to come. We don't lead the story, but when you have a Western media model that has people flying in, mainly from London, if not from America, that inevitably they would be drawn to the action, and once the action abated, they would leave. And I think that's all a budgetary issue, but I think the consequence at home is that you get a very, as you I think implied, you get a very kind of limited and distorted view of the situation, and that's what diverse alternative sources of information I think are aimed at combating, because that kind of distorted view of the world is not the kind of view that should be the predominant one in America.
Can I just ask Tony a question about that? Because that's something that I've always wanted to ask you is, how is it that Al Jazeera-English has people covering in-depth elections across Africa? I mean, how many people do you hire? And why don't the other agencies do this? I mean, is it so expensive, so it's just money? Or is it a different distribution on how you get those stories? Because I look at Al Jazeera-English and I'm just aghast at the depth of it and the superficial nature of CBS, and I'm asking myself, is it just money? Or is it a different way of hiring?
Well, I think it is. I think it's what you, as a news organization, what you choose to invest. And clearly, I mean, you know, Al Jazeera is, I mean, I come from a lifetime of working with the CDC, which is Canada's public broadcaster. The bulk of its funds, like the BBC in Canada, comes from the Canadian government. In Britain, the BBC is largely funded by the British government, the British people through its government. In Qatar, the Al Jazeera is funded through the Qatar government, more or less as a public broadcaster, and you don't have that model here in America. So if it's a commercial model, you know, so in other words, we do not have, Al Jazeera is able to have 70 news bureaus without the selling of soap on commercials having anything to do with whether or not these bureaus should be sustained. I think if you create a news model whereby the news has to be sold like comedy shows or entertainment shows, it has to produce the kind of revenue that you get out of entertainment or sports, whatever, to fund your news division, then you're in trouble, because news will never make that kind of money. I mean, I was at a seminar in the Paley Center in New York City, and I had an opportunity to use the line I always like to use, is that Bill Paley, the founder of CBS News in the 50s, etc., you know, he was always asked, well, at that point, why did CBS have such a large and respected news organization then, not now, then? And he said, well, he says, because what happened, the idea then was that commercial broadcasters would invest a lot in their news departments because they would be able to make money on other parts of the business. And he said, I make money on Jack Benny, a comedian. I make money on Jack Benny, so I can invest it all in news. That rather public-spirited commercial approach, which was the 60s, is gone. You know, so now what you do is you sit around a table in NBC or ABC and you ask the head of the sports division, how much money have you made for me lately, whether it's covering the Masters or NHL hockey, and the answer is X, Y, or Z, and you look at the news division, well, how much money have you made for me lately? But anybody who knows about the broadcast model is that that's a wrong question. If you're going to ask that question, then what you're going to do is you're going to cut your four bureaus. You're going to create a program like Dateline that, you know, focuses on, you know, the sexiest, grabbiest stories. You trivialize all sorts of things. So that's where I say the model is different. I mean, so Jazeera, on the one hand, I think is very intent on investing. On the other hand, it has the resources, you know, and like there's no embarrassment on the Qatari government in a way to, you know, to ensure that Jazeera would have a worldwide presence, has decided to invest a percentage of its considerable income into this. And the reality is that, and having a public broadcaster is, I think that some of you know, is actually the norm in most countries. It's only here in the U.S. you have such a small, under-resourced PBS and such a small NPR, whereas you go through Europe and you go through, obviously, Britain, the idea of having a public broadcaster that would be disconnected from the commercial model, at least is one opportunity for people in their country to get information.
You're saying something very profound. You're saying that it's not that America's incapable of that. It's not because the Qataris are so wealthy. It's that Bill Paley had a moral conscience about this as a wealthy CEO, and that conscience is gone.
Exactly. And these companies, whether it's Disney, whether it's General Electric, the companies that
own these networks and own these news divisions are filthy rich. You know, they're making a lot of money. The approach used to be, we're making a lot of money because we've been given by the American people access to the public airwaves to make all of this money. Therefore, in exchange, we created a news service that, you know, that helps the country. That whole kind of social contract is over, is gone, you know, and so, you know, Americans are screwed, you know. You know, it's trapped in a model that doesn't work, you know, and that's, you know, that's frustrating because there's no way out of it, you know. That's immediate.
I think you're right. I think it's the profit motive in media that is causing the kind of a focus on the short term. Tony said before, you had 22 minutes for the evening broadcast, and in that 22 minutes you've really got to capture and cover a lot of issues. And some important editorial decisions are being made where the revolution in Libya is given less time than the activities of Charlie Sheen. Because, you know, which one is more titillating, which one is going to get more attention. However, there are different channels available, and that we did bring up NPR and other public broadcasting stations that do look at the bigger picture, that look at the long-term consequences, that have discussion shows, that bring people on and examine those issues. If you're interested in the bigger picture, then you will spend less time looking at the nightly news and more time looking at a variety of other media, including blogs and a whole range of different media that provide more in-depth coverage. It has to do with our curiosity as viewers, as audience members, and our ability to really seek information. And I'm not really convinced that overall the general public is all that curious, that maybe they want quick and easy answers. They don't want to really examine all the alternatives. But as the world becomes more combative and more complex, we need information so we all can make good decisions and decide what it is we want to do. And one of the things that we're trying to do at the university is to foster that sense of curiosity, that sense of investigation, that sense of what's really going on and how are we going to deal with it. Hopefully you will be the next generation of audience members who are going to be asking for more, who will be looking more deeply and broadly and participating more actively in public dialogue. I'm hoping that's the future.
Well, on that optimistic note, hopeful note, inspirational note, I think that it's time to once again offer our thanks to the panel who offered very insightful and interesting, and even some sound bites, I would argue, in the presentation today. And of course to Professor Klein and Professor Klein's students who helped make this event as successful as it was. Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming.